Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Seth Monahan, board certified music theory geek, and I hope you brought a box of tissues, because today's topic is the lament bass, or why passing 5/6 in minor is the saddest chord on earth. So if you watched video 27, you know all about passing 5/6 in major keys. Well, the principle is the same in minor, but the chord itself, the passing 5/6, is actually different. Here's the opening of Mendelssohn's Ruy Blas Overture. It's in C minor, and notice that the bass starts on tonic and walks down to scale degree 5, just like a bunch of the major key pieces we saw in the last video. Have a listen, and then we'll do a quick analysis. Now, we saw in the last video that when a bass line steps from tonic down to scale degree 5 in major, we tend to have root position chords on the outside, tonic and dominant, and then inverted chords in between. And that's true here too. In this case, we have two 6/3 chords, two first inversion triads connecting 1 and 5. But we're not going down the major scale anymore, we're going down the natural minor scale. Now in this case, the second connecting chord is just a regular predominant, a minor 4/6. But the first connecting chord, the passing 5/6, isn't like any 5 chord we've seen before. It's a first inversion minor dominant triad. Think about this for a second. In almost 30 videos, this is the first time we've ever seen a dominant triad in minor that didn't have raised scale degree 7 in it. Well, this is pretty much the one time you ever get to use the minor dominant in the classical style, as a passing chord to help our bass line walk down from tonic to dominant. Now, I want to be very clear here. The dominant at the end of the phrase, at the half cadence, is not a minor triad, it's a major triad. It contains a leading tone and has an actual dominant function. The minor dominant doesn't ever get used in root position, let alone at a half cadence. It's just used as a non-functional passing chord. But it's still really important because it's part of an idiom that carried special weight in Western music for literally hundreds of years. That idiom is called the lament bass. It comes in lots of varieties, but you're looking at the simplest one. Tonic, minor 5/6, minor 4/6, and then 5. And it's not strictly a classical idiom at all. In fact, its heyday was the early Baroque, which is a period we don't talk about very much in these videos. But think about it. Mendelssohn wrote this overture for a Victor Hugo play that took place in the late 17th century, more than 100 years before he was born. So it makes sense that he'd set the stage with this old-fashioned progression, with music that seems to say once upon a time. Well, if Mendelssohn wants to lead us on a journey into the past, I think we should take him up on the offer. So the rest of the video is going to be a kind of historical show and tell. We'll do some analysis, and at one point we'll do a little voice leading, but for the most part, I just want to play you some fantastic music, and a lot of it from a period we don't talk about much in this series. Because the thing is, the lament bass isn't just interesting because it's stuck around for almost 300 years, it's also interesting because there are so many different variations of it. So let's go back to the very beginning. The year is 1638, and the big composer of his day, Claudio Monteverdi, takes time off from inventing opera to write his 8th book of madrigals. And there's a little gem in there called The Lament of the Nymph. Here's an image of the historical score with continuo at the bottom and 4 singers above. A soprano, the nymph who's been forsaken by her lover, and 3 shepherds who comment on the proceedings. Now, the whole piece is beautiful and heartbreaking, but Monteverdi's masterstroke is the continuo part. Notice 2 things. First, it starts with this simple stepwise motion down from A, which captures the nymph's sinking spirit, but also notice that it just repeats over and over and over again. And the effect is incredible. Sadness becomes despair, this atmosphere of inescapable grief. We just keep going around in circles, hearing the same progression again and again with no hope of breaking away. Here's what the opening looks like in modern notation. Now, I should mention that Monteverdi isn't the first composer to use a 4-note looping bass like this, but it was still a pretty recent invention, and his probably made the biggest impact. So when you listen, see if you can figure out why this trick, the repeating lament bass, made such a splash with early Baroque listeners. Now, I do want to say one little technical thing here. You may have noticed that the continuo part has no bass figures. That's not because Monteverdi wants a bunch of root position triads. No, the figure bass comes from an era in which many things were left unwritten because composers trusted performers to know certain things. Now, I'm no expert in the early Italian Baroque, but I've listened to a lot of performances by experts, and from what I can gather, players in the early 1600s would have known 3 things about this bass line. It starts and ends on what we would call root position triads. The G above the E should be raised to G sharp, and the 2 chords in the middle should have a 3rd and possibly a 6th above the bass. In other words, performers would play something really close to the lament progression we saw in Mendelssohn almost exactly 200 years later. Now, as I said, people went nuts over this simple but very powerful device. But no one went crazier than Monteverdi's student, one Francesco Cavalli. Only 2 years after Monteverdi's Lament, Cavalli puts one in his opera, The Loves of Apollo and Daphne. Here's another historical score. This one's handwritten, and again we see the continuo written out with no accidentals. Same deal, the performers are just supposed to understand what to do. And here's the vocal entrance in modern notation, and notice how much more twisted and chromatic the line is than Monteverdi's. We actually get all of the chromatic notes between E and A. We have E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, and A. Here's how it sounds. So Cavalli was obviously impressed enough with the lament bass to steal it, and use it again, and again, and again in pretty much every opera he'd write from that point onward. Here it is 3 years later in Egisto. And here it is almost 30 years later in Eliogaballo. Now, I'm not here to make fun of Cavalli. He's actually a fantastic composer, and he did some novel things with the Lament, as we'll see in a few minutes. But first, I want to pause for a second and talk about one of the most common ways of embellishing the lament bass progression. I don't know if Cavalli invented it, but we heard it in that first excerpt I played. I'll call it the Cavalli archetype. And I want to build it from the ground up, thinking about it in 2 ways at once, in historical terms and modern terms. So let's say you're Cavalli, and it's, 1643, and you've got this 4-note bass line. And you want to add other notes to it without too much fuss. You're not going to think in terms of chords or Roman numerals because those concepts literally haven't been invented yet. Instead, you're going to think in terms of intervals, consonant and dissonant intervals above the bass. And the first voice to add is a freebie. It just goes in parallel thirds or tenths with the bass. But then you'll probably think about adding a third voice, one that's consonant against the bass line, avoids bad parallels, and mostly avoids duplicate notes. So you start with E, a fifth above the bass, but on the next chord, you can't go to D because it makes parallel fifths. But we can't just stay on E, which is now a sixth above the bass. And when the bass goes to F, the top voice has to move to stay consonant, so you dip down to D to make a second sixth against the bass. And since you can't stay on D for the last chord, why not go back up to E for a consonant octave at the end? What you've just made sounds like this. And of course, this is a three-voice version of the lament progression we saw in our very first example. As 21st century analysts, we'd call this tonic, passing 5-6, 4-6 as predominant, and finally 5. Okay, so to make the thing I'm calling the Cavalli archetype, we have to play around with that top voice to make a chain of dissonant suspensions. Let's start by turning the whole notes into half notes. Then, in the second half of bar 1, let's move that E up to F. Now, you and I would call that a non-chord tone, something that needs to resolve, but for Cavalli, that's just a consonant note above the bass. A sixth instead of a fifth, and we will have to just agree to disagree about that. But we're also going to move the next E up to F and tie it over from the bar before. And in this case, we're going to be on the same page as Cavalli, but for different reasons. We look at this and say, okay, that's a non-chord tone, a suspension, it has to resolve by step. Cavalli sees this and hears a dissonant seventh above the bass, F over G, and he also is going to want to resolve it by step, which of course he does. But to finish the archetype, we have to take that note of resolution, the E, and tie it over into the next bar as well. Now we've made our chain of suspensions, and the whole thing sounds like this. And if it sounds familiar, it's because we heard it a few minutes ago. Here's Cavalli's Misero Apollo, which uses exactly this chain of suspensions. And if you go looking, you'll find it in 100 other places as well. It's a very easy and very catchy way to spice up the lament progression. But before we do more music, I've got two quick sidebars for you. First, if you're the kind of person who wants to show these red non-chord tones in your analysis, you can do it with figured bass, just like we learned in video 23. Next to the Roman numeral 1, we can show the moving top voice with a figure 5 going to a 6. Right? That's E moving to F above A. And then in the next two bars, we can show the suspensions, the sevenths above the bass resolving downward by step, with a 7 that leads to a 6. And second, I want to point out that the second half of bar 1 contains something we learned about in video 22, a non-chord tone that creates a sort of pseudo-chord. Because if we just look at the second part of the bar, there's a first inversion F major triad, a 6-6 chord, if you will. Now, I'm going to put that in scare quotes because in this context, I don't think of it as a real chord. But there are cases here and there where this 6-6 actually substitutes for tonic, as in we get the 6-6 chord instead of the tonic rather than after it. In fact, we're going to see that in just a second because it's time to dive back into our show and tell. So as you might expect, the looping lament bass eventually becomes too much of a cliche to keep getting used in opera. But the progression itself sticks around, and we find it all over the place in Baroque music, where it gives composers just one more type of functional cycle to play with. Here is the opening of Corelli's C minor Concerto Grosso, and the phrase combines a motion from tonic to dominant and back with the lament we saw earlier, except that the second quote-unquote tonic chord is actually that 6-6 chord I mentioned before. It's substituting for tonic with a non-chordal A-flat in the top voice. Here's another Corelli example. This one's an early instance of sentence form, and it opens with a cliche we know well. Tonic to dominant in the basic idea, and then dominant to tonic when that idea repeats. But the second half, the continuation, is based on the lament progression. 1, passing minor 5, 4, 6, and a half cadential 5. And at this point, I know what you're thinking. Yeah, Corelli used it, but did Bach use it? Of course, he used it all the time. Here's the opening of the air from the E minor keyboard partita, and he uses the progression right out of the box, 1 chord per half bar. And here's the Courante from the C minor French suite, which sits on tonic for 2 bars before then darting down the lament bass to 5. Okay, so that's Bach. How about Mozart? Heck yeah! Here's the second movement of the E minor violin sonata, which little Wolfgang wrote right after his mother died. You see where I'm going with that? We're looking at a contrasting period whose antecedent and consequent both end on half cadences. And I know that's weird, but they're actually part of a thing called a double period, which I'm not going to talk about right now. And if we look at the bass line of the antecedent, oh, look at that. Sounds like our lament. But there's a neat little twist. In the third bar, we're expecting 4-6, which is an A minor triad. And the first cool thing is that Mozart has not 1 but 2 suspensions here, F sharp and B, both rearticulated. The other cool thing is that the B, a 7th above the bass, doesn't actually resolve to A. It resolves to A sharp. Which means, among other things, this is not an A minor triad at all. It's called an Italian augmented 6th chord, and I'm not going to talk about that either. Now, the 4-note lament progression gets rarer as time goes on, but we can find it even as late as Schumann. This is 50 years after the Mozart we just heard in the little character piece Child Falling Asleep from Kinderszenen. This one oscillates 1 and 5/6 at the opening before it steps down the natural minor scale. But just like Mozart, this one has a cool detail on the 3rd chord, the predominant. Look at the top voice in the left hand. It starts the lament on scale degree 5. And if you remember earlier, this voice would normally repeat 5, dip down to 4, and then go back up to 5. But that's not what Schumann does. So what does he do? Nothing. He has that voice, which is doubled in the right hand, just stay on the B the whole time. Including in the 3rd chord where it doesn't belong. And because of this, we don't get an A minor triad as our predominant, we get a C major 7th chord, or 6-7. It's the moment that really makes this passage special. Now, I could go on, but I actually want to reverse course and go back to Cavalli, because in the same year that he borrowed the 4-note lament from Monteverdi, he also started tinkering with other versions. Here's an aria from the opera La Didone from 1640. Once again, it's just a melody plus unfigured bass, but look at the repeating bass pattern. It starts on G, leaps up to another G, and then starts its descent. But instead of going down the natural minor scale, it moves chromatically 1/2 step at a time. Here it is in modern notation. In terms of scale degrees, it starts on scale degree 1, then moves through all the different versions of 6 and 7 that we find in the melodic minor scale. Raised 7, lowered 7, raised 6, lowered 6, then on to 5, 4, and the raised version of 3. We're going to call this bass line, and others like it, the chromatic lament. Notice 3 things here. First, I'm using up and down arrows to show the raised and lowered forms of scale degrees rather than accidentals. It's just less confusing that way, so I'm going to do this for the rest of the video. Second, notice that Cavalli's bass descends through a minor sixth, G down to B, while touching on every single chromatic note except C sharp or D flat. That's the tritone of the tonic G. And because he's not going to use that, there is a whole step between D and C. Third, and finally, notice that when the lament ends, we don't immediately start the next one. There's a little cadential tag at the end, predominant, dominant, and tonic. Now, speaking of function, with chromatic bass lines like this, harmonic function is a can of worms I would rather not open. In fact, I'm not generally even going to talk about the specific chords the bass line supports. There are a bunch of them that we don't know yet anyway. But I do want to focus on the musical effect that the chromatic lament has as opposed to the diatonic one. When we listen, ask yourself, what's the difference here in terms of its mood or expression? Is there a difference? You tell me. For me, at least, the chromatic lament is more intense, more expressive than the diatonic one. The diatonic one is sad but austere. The chromatic one feels more anguished to me, partly because it just takes longer. This one is 8 notes long rather than 4, and it's nearly all half steps. That matters. For hundreds of years, the falling semitone was itself a symbol of grief, a kind of anguished sigh. When you build a whole bass line out of them, the effect can be really creepy. And composers in the 1600s must have liked that sound because the chromatic lament took off, just like the diatonic one. It turns up everywhere. But most versions are a bit shorter than this one. It's more common to descend by 5 half steps, just from tonic to dominant. Cavalli does this 3 years later in Egisto. And in this case, I think maybe we can talk about function. Tonic moves through 3 passing chords to a predominant above scale degree 6, and then dominant. Here's how it sounds. Here's another one. This is actually from one of the most famous arias of the whole 17th century, When I Am Laid in Earth, from Purcell's Dido and Aeneas. And it uses that same pattern we just heard, the 6-note chromatic lament that ends on scale degree 5. But this one has a little cadential turnaround at the end of each 5-bar unit. Now, the tone painting here is really very effective, if not entirely subtle, right? The woman is singing about her dead body being lowered into the ground, and the chromatic lament just keeps looping around like this elevator to the underworld. Later in the Baroque, J.S. Bach is going to use a looping chromatic lament to set the mood for the darkest moment of his Mass in B minor, the Crucifixus movement, which is the part of the Mass that tells about the crucifixion and death of Jesus. The whole fabric of the music seethes with pain and anguish. Even the voices enter with these pained, sighing gestures. Now, by the end of the Baroque, this kind of looping chromatic lament ends up becoming just as much of a cliche as the diatonic one. But just like the diatonic lament, it also makes its way into just regular chordal syntax. Here's Corelli again, using a single pass through the chromatic descent to start off a quartet movement in B minor. And after that, he doesn't repeat the lament, he just moves on to new things. So, if you're a harmony geek like me, one of the most interesting things about the chromatic lament is how many different ways composers harmonized it. Look at Corelli here. The bass is chromatic, but the upper voices, the other chord tones, are all diatonic. The only accidental is A sharp, the leading tone of the key, which we'd expect. Now, compare that to the opening of Mozart's C minor piano concerto. I want you to notice two things here. First, we start out on a tonic triad, but when the bass is ready to start descending, Mozart puts a fully diminished seventh above the tonic. And then every chord in the descent is another fully diminished seven. It's kind of a bonkers way to harmonize this line. The other thing I love here is that when the bass finally gets to scale degree 5 at the start of the second system, there's no sense of arrival. We'd normally expect a dominant there, but instead we get a tonic 6/4, and the music just keeps circling around scale degree 5, drawing out a predominant function for another 8 bars until the dominant finally crashes into place in the last bar. This is definitely Mozart at his most dramatic. So I'll admit, Mozart's lament basses are my favorite because he uses differences in harmony to color them in so many different ways, depending on context. Here is a very different take on the chromatic bass from the overture to Don Giovanni. Where the C minor concerto was ferocious and just bitingly dissonant, this one's softer, more ethereal. There are a few diminished seventh chords, but also consonant triads, even a minor seventh chord above raised scale degree 6. The best part, though, is that if you know the opera, you'll recognize this as a premonition. It foreshadows the moment that clinches the entire story when the murdered Commendatore comes back as a statue to give Don Giovanni one last chance at redemption. And the fantastic thing is that in that scene, Mozart gets rid of the chromatic bass and goes back to the diatonic one, giving it a kind of brutal simplicity and moral clarity as opposed to the nebulous creeping passage in the overture. But they're still very clearly related. Notice how the statue's vocal line comes directly from those octave drops on D and on A in the overture. This game here, where you swap out the diatonic lament for the chromatic one, or vice versa, is one that Mozart knows well. He actually did it 10 years earlier in that violin sonata we heard a few minutes ago. Last time I only gave you 8 bars. Now I'll give you the whole theme, which is actually 16 bars. It starts with 2 4-bar phrases that end on a half cadence, and then Mozart varies these to end on a full cadence. And hopefully you remember from before that the first 8-bar unit starts with the 4-note diatonic lament, while the second time through Mozart turns up the heat and gives us the full chromatic lament, and that delicate pent-up suffering of the piano opening phrase gives way to a full-throated cry of anguish. So with that, I'm going to end our little history lesson. By now, you've probably forgotten that we actually did learn a new chord here today, passing 5-6 in minor, which is pretty much the only minor dominant that classical composers will ever use. So at this point, you probably want to go out and get some fresh air. We heard a lot of depressing music today. I promise to keep it light next time. See you then.